Imagine Rome not merely as a collection of ruins meant to attract tourists, but as the vibrant, colossal entity it once was, teeming with life, power, and ambition. It was a city where emperors shaped the destinies of millions, where legions marched across vast continents, and where the known world turned in accordance with their commands. Now envision that same Rome, stripped of its glory, plundered, desecrated, and reduced to echoes of its former self. The fall of Rome was not a swift or singular event. Rather, it unfolded over centuries as a gradual and corrosive decline catalyzed by misguided decisions, internal betrayals, and external threats that the empire neglected for far too long. In this exploration, we will unpack the intricacies of this downfall, examining those commonly labeled as barbarians and understanding that they were merely the final chapter in a narrative that had been disassembling for many years. Every ruin carries within it the story of its past, and Rome's tale begins at its height. In the 1st century AD, Rome appeared invulnerable. Under the reign of emperors like Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan, the empire achieved its greatest territorial extent. From the dense forests of Britannia to the arid expanses of Arabia, from the banks of the Rhine River to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, Rome stretched over nearly 5 million square kilometers and housed more than 60 million citizens. Remarkably, 1 in every 4 individuals on the planet lived under the aegis of Roman authority. The Pax Romana ushered in 2 centuries of relative peace. Intricate road networks spanned vast distances, aqueducts brought fresh water to parched areas, and a cohesive identity was fostered through a shared language, currency, and architectural style. The legions maintained order and trade thrived. On the surface, it all seemed to function seamlessly. Yet, beneath this facade, cracks were already forming. The empire had grown vast, each newly acquired province demanding more soldiers, more administrators, and more resources. It was dependent on extensive estates supported by slave labor. As territorial expansion halted, however, the influx of new slaves dwindled, leading the economic system to falter. The empire was constructed upon a foundation of perpetual conflict, but when conquest ceased, the machinery of power turned inward. Taxation escalated, pushing the free populace into poverty. Year after year, the costs of sustaining the imperial apparatus exceeded its revenues. By the 2nd century, a silent famine gripped the empire, not one of food, but rather a famine of currency and economic vitality. Trade routes that had once brought goods from far-off lands began collapsing under the weight of constant warfare, piracy, and instability, rendering transportation perilous. Without the steady stream of tributes from distant provinces and fresh lands to exploit, the empire found itself in a deep fiscal crisis. In a desperate bid to fund military expenditures and public projects, the state began debasing its currency, reducing the amounts of gold and silver while increasing the copper content, which led to rampant inflation. Prices soared as the cost of basic goods, like grain, doubled within mere weeks. Trust in currency eroded. The burden of taxes fell most heavily on the small landowners, artisans, and farmers. Many could no longer maintain their land and were forced to abandon it. In this turbulent landscape, a new system began to take root. In search of security, thousands voluntarily submitted to powerful landowners, trading their labor for protection against tax collectors, soldiers, and marauders. This model of direct dependence, where peasants toiled for safety, sowed the seeds of what would evolve into feudalism, arising from the failures of a state incapable of ensuring justice, security, or even survival. The economic collapse weakened Rome but also fertilized the ground for a new order born out of desperation. While the economy disintegrated quietly, the realm of Roman politics was embroiled in chaos. Starting into 35 AD, the empire descended into what historians call the military anarchy. In a short span of just 49 years, over 20 emperors ascended the throne, most of whom met grisly ends: murdered, ousted, or slain in battle. Stability was elusive, no throne was secure. Generals seized power, bolstered by their armies. The military campaigns that once focused on external adversaries turned inward, leading two brothers in arms clashing in brutal civil wars. The unity of Rome began to dissolve from within. As the legions were consumed by infighting, Rome's borders lay exposed. Germanic tribes surged across the Rhine, Sarmatians invaded Pannonia. Armed bands ravaged entire regions, leaving cities defenseless. The populace came to fear not only foreign invaders but also their own soldiers, who looted Roman towns and villas as if they were enemy territories. The historian Zosimus characterizes this chaotic period as one in which Rome seemed to devour itself, a sentiment that was far from exaggeration. Imperial authority became a contested prize rather than a respected symbol of order. To survive the turmoil, Rome sought to reinvent itself through a radical restructuring, the division of the empire into two distinct halves. In 85 AD, Emperor Diocletian established the Tetrarchy, a governing system comprising the senior emperors, Augusti, and to junior emperors, Caesars, each responsible for managing part of the empire. Although this division aimed to effectively address crises using localized administrations and armies, it ultimately bred a division that would never fully heal. The Eastern Empire, with its vital cities such as Antioch, Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, emerged as economically stronger, benefiting from advantageous trade routes, fortified cities, and defensible borders. The Western Empire, in stark contrast, faced ongoing invasions, irregular harvests, demographic crises, and an army that struggled against constant underfunding. As the East consolidated its authority, the West experienced an ongoing loss of power, with the city of Rome, once the epicenter of imperial dominance, reduced to a mere symbol rather than a seat of real authority. It was within this weakened Western Empire that the so-called barbarians found their opportunity. But who were these so-called barbarians? To the Romans, the term barbarian served as an umbrella label for anyone outside the Greco-Roman sphere, those speaking unfamiliar languages or who did not adhere to Roman customs and laws. However, this label obscured much more than it disclosed. The so-called barbarians were an array of disparate groups with their own identities, cultures, and ambitions. This included the Goths, divided into the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, semi-nomadic peoples who had long served as military allies to Rome. Other groups, like the Vandals, moved through Gaul to Hispania before establishing a powerful presence in North Africa. The Saxons and Franks expanded along the Rhine frontier, while the Huns, a fearsome force from the Eurasian steppes, struck terror into the hearts of all who faced them. Many of these groups did not seek to destroy Rome, but rather wanted to become part of it. They sought land, protection, and a share of status within the empire. Some were embraced as allies and gifted official titles, given military or administrative roles. Yet, Rome's condescension made true coexistence nearly impossible. Even those welcomed were met with deep suspicion and contempt, and the diplomatic relationships with these peoples quickly soured. Soon, the groups who once knocked at Rome's gates would charge through them. The so-called barbarian invasions were not random occurrences. They were part of a much larger, chaotic movement, migrations of entire populations, tribes, and clans, driven by an array of factors both internal and external. The arrival of the Huns on the empire's eastern borders sent ripples of panic among the Germanic tribes residing nearby. Visigoths, Vandals, and others fled en masse, seeking refuge within Roman territory. Internally, the diminishing availability of fertile land in their homes, coupled with overpopulation, compelled many tribes to seek new opportunities elsewhere. Even in its decline, Rome symbolized stability, wealth, and hope, a beacon that beckoned many barbarian groups desperate for a fresh start. However, by this point, Rome lacked the structures necessary to accommodate them. Its borders had thinned, its officials had become corrupt, and its resources had been depleted. Negotiated attempts at integration often fell flat, undermined by bad faith, poor planning, or sheer prejudice. What could have developed into cooperation morphed into conflict. Migrations escalated into overwhelming avalanches as one tribe displaced another, igniting a flurry of movement across entire regions. Some sought peace, while others sought plunder. Ultimately, the unstable empire had neither the strength nor the clarity to respond effectively. For centuries, Rome had adeptly used barbarian groups to its advantage, welcoming many as foederati entire tribal communities allowed to settle within the empire in exchange for military assistance. This system naturally placed thousands of Germanic soldiers, Alans, Vandals, and Goths under Roman banners, entrusted with protecting borders, patrolling roads, and battling mutual foes. Some rose to prominent positions. Barbarian leaders were entertained with titles like dux or comes, governing whole regions and marrying into Roman aristocracy. On the surface, this partnership appeared functional, yet beneath it all simmered a churning resentment. Romans often regarded these allies as inferior, and even when their presence became vital, they were met with mistrust, humiliation, and abuse. This systemic disdain eventually transformed allies into adversaries. The turning point came in 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople, when the mistreated Visigoths revolted against Roman officials while in search of asylum. Emperor Valens, advancing confidently but inadequately prepared, met with disaster. He was killed in action, and approximately two-thirds of his army was annihilated. This was more than a military defeat. It starkly illustrated that the so-called barbarians were no longer mere forces shrouded in the background, but had now emerged as pivotal players in the unfolding tale of Rome. As the Goths carved out their roles in history, an even more menacing threat emerged on the horizon: Attila. While Rome grappled with the Goths and Vandals, the Huns, wild and formidable horsemen from Central Asia, began to rise. Attila's leadership, which commenced in 430 AD, marked a turning point as he united fragmented tribes, instilled discipline within the ranks of his nomadic warriors, and transformed the Huns into a transcontinental powerhouse. He was more than just a warlord. He was a political mastermind, an astute diplomat, and a ruthless strategist. Negotiating with Rome when it benefited him, Attila also razed cities that defied him. Under his command, the Huns stormed through the Balkans, threatened Constantinople, exacted lavish tributes, and laid waste to lands spanning from the Danube to the Black Sea. With his gaze firmly fixed on the west, panic intensified throughout the empire. Roman sources struggled to articulate the terror that Attila instilled in their hearts, labeling him Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, not out of divine reverence, but because such destruction defied logical explanation. Yet Attila's ambitions reached a peak in 451 AD with his invasion of Gaul, a monumental offensive aimed squarely at dismantling the Western Roman Empire. In the path of destruction, cities succumbed, panic rose, and collapse appeared imminent. However, against all odds, an unforeseen coalition arose. Flavius Idius, one of the last great generals of Rome, rallied imperial soldiers alongside the Visigoths, led by Theodoric I, and other federated tribes for a desperate stand. The ensuing battle on the Catalaunian plains became one of the bloodiest confrontations of late antiquity. Although Attila was repelled, Theodoric fell in combat, leaving the empire in a precarious position. But relief was fleeting. In 450 AD, Attila returned to Italy, launching an invasion that devastated cities such as Aquileia, plunging the entire peninsula into chaos. Once again, it seemed that doom awaited Rome. Yet, in an unexpected twist, Pope Leo I personally intervened with Attila. The specifics of their meeting remain unknown. Some speak of miracles, while others reference the threat of famine or disease. Regardless of the underlying reasons, Attila retreated, sparing Rome another catastrophe. Yet, the following year, Attila died, causing his vast nomadic empire to fracture. Nevertheless, the damage was irrevocable. Rome had physically endured but was left exhausted and demoralized. Even before the ominous shadow of Attila loomed over the empire, an unthinkable event had already occurred. In 410 AD, the Eternal City, impervious to invasions for nearly 8 centuries, fell. Strikingly, it wasn't some distant enemy that orchestrated Rome's downfall, but a once-ally-turned adversary, Alaric, the king of the Visigoths. Alaric had spent years in service to Rome, a general who fought valiantly, sought diplomatic negotiations, and demanded fair compensation. Yet, each time he was met with betrayal and humiliation. Eventually realizing that the empire would never honor its commitments, Alaric made a historic choice to march on Rome. By that time, the city may have lost its administrative significance, but it remained the symbolic embodiment of imperial authority. When its gates opened, there was scant resistance. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered temples, mansions, warehouses, and monuments. While the violence was not characterized by widespread slaughter or total obliteration, the psychological ramifications were profound. Observers around the world looked on in disbelief. For many, this was not merely a sack but the signifying end of an era. St. Jerome reflected the collective horror of the moment, declaring, "The world is collapsing." Though Alaric did not physically annihilate the city, he shattered the myth of Rome's invincibility. This myth had been the glue holding the empire together in the minds of many. From that moment, the idea that Rome could fall took firm root, and the Vandals would soon demonstrate that it could be plundered yet again with even more readiness and efficiency. 45 years after Alaric's sack, Rome would face devastation yet again, but this time it would be met with a new level of precision and intent. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to support our work and never miss an upload. Like this video, drop a comment, and share it with others to show your support and help us grow this historical community.